Hi, my name is Leslie Hamilton. If I haven't had the pleasure to meet you yet, I'm glad to be bringing this week's Lenten lesson. So I was pleased to be assigned The Gift of Love, the story of Marius and Cosette, which is one of my favorite stories as part of the musical and the story Les Miserables. And this comes from The Grace of Les Miserables, the book that we have been using for this Lenten study. So, at the beginning of the chapter, the author mentions that love is the folly of men and the wisdom of God, and it talks about this epic love story that helps bring light, hope, and motivation to the story. And it reminds us that as Christians, our motivation is love. We need to love our neighbor, love God, and love people, as the story reminds us. So in previous weeks, you have learned, or if you've seen the musical, you know the story of Fantine and also of Javert and Jean Valjean. And this chapter, it talks about Cosette and what happened to Cosette after her mother died. So Fantine dies. She has left her daughter and entrusted to the Thénardiers, who, even though they seem to be charming and have a very stable home life, they end up neglecting her and abusing her and mistreating her, and treating their other children much better than their adopted charge. And one of my favorite songs in the musical is "Castle on a Cloud," which is Cosette thinking of her mother and what life would have been like if her mother lived. And she's dressed all in white. And I'm going to sing the first part of this song to you, thinking about from Cosette's point of view, what she is wishing was happening. So it starts out, "There is a castle on a cloud. I'd like to go there in my sleep. Aren't any floors for me to sweep? Not in my castle on a cloud." So in this, she is thinking about her mom, wishing that there weren't any floors for her to clean because she's doing all the work at this inn, even though the other kids are, eating and having fun, and she's having to do all this work. So it kind of continues on the story to Christmas Eve when the Thénardiers send Cosette on an errand to fetch some water, and it's freezing outside, and she ends up meeting Jean Valjean, and he is so excited that he has ended up meeting Fantine's daughter, finding her, and he goes to rescue her, but she doesn't know who he is, and he doesn't tell her at that time. So he offers the Thénardiers some money, says that he'll provide for Cosette, and it seems like the perfect scenario for them. And they are happy to take him up on that offer. And it mentions that for Cosette, Jean Valjean seems kind of like a Saint Nicholas, that he's there to save the day and rescues her and makes things better. Then it kind of skips ahead to when Cosette is a teenager and she's living with Jean Valjean in a convent where they're trying to kind of hide away from Javert and him and Jean Valjean getting arrested again, and they're living in safety and peace. But Cosette is matured, but she feels stifled and imprisoned because she's not really able to leave her house. And truthfully, this kind of reminds me a little bit of the pandemic in this past year, in that we, not because we were going to be arrested if we go out in the streets, but because it's not safe necessarily for us to go out. And so we feel stifled and maybe even imprisoned in our own house. The author of this chapter talks about his children and how he, as a parent, worries about giving them the appropriate safety and guidance and wanting to keep them safe, but then allowing them to go out into the world and find themselves and experience the world itself. So I know that's a kind of a balancing act that parents do with their children. And it kind of made me chuckle a little bit, is that he wishes that there was a guide written by Jesus called The Parent's Guide to Raising Children. That would be very helpful if Jesus had written such a book. So Jean Valjean is keeping Cosette safe. He thinks everything's in the clear and she's going to be fine and that she'll be with him forever, until they happen to run into and meet Marius. And Marius is enamored by Cosette's beauty and falls in love with her. And Valjean sees something, or has something happen that he never thought would happen, that someone falling in love with his adopted daughter would end up taking her away and that he would lose her. So then we start learning about the story of Marius, and Marius, as it's mentioned by the author, is very susceptible to whatever direction the wind is blowing. So initially, we learn that he's the grandson of Monsieur Gillenormand, and he's kind of a curmudgeon grandfather, and he is a strong believer in the monarchy, and so that's kind of how initially Marius is raised. And Marius's father actually is in Napoleon's Legion of Honor, and he is a colonel in that army. And because Marius's mother had died when he was young, the grandfather kind of vilified his dad, and kind of forbade him from seeing him, telling him he's a traitor and a crook, just because the grandfather did not agree with the father's politics and how that he was living his life. So Marius became a supporter of the monarchy, but then as his father kind of sneaks in and sees his son, and as Marius is meeting some of his other friends and realizing some of the tides that are changing, he finally realizes who his father really is, and that he's a decorated colonel in the army, and that he has done some wonderful things on behalf of France. So then Marius becomes a follower and supporter of Napoleon. But then, as often teenagers might do, then he realizes that he kind of goes with his friends and may follow the Republic at that time in fighting for their independence. And the author tells a story at this point about, it mentions how can Marius be appalled by everything that his grandfather supported? And he asks, have you ever learned something that made you rethink everything? So the example he gives is when Jesus had to show his wounds to Thomas on the road after the resurrection, because Thomas didn't believe it was him until he showed him his wounds on his hands. And the author mentions that he had always had a picture in his head that Jesus' body would be glowing and perfect, and not that he would have wounds still in his hand. And so how surprising that may have been for Thomas to see Jesus and have to be shown Jesus' wounds to believe that it was really him. And it kind of makes us think about, have we ever been conditioned to accept teachings that we've been offered? And it talks about John Wesley, and the author mentions, he's like, I would love to say that all Methodists are Methodists because of John Wesley's understanding of prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace. But more often than not, they feel connected to the people who are sitting in the pews with them. Joining a church because of the people is not a bad thing, though we must always be aware that the story we've been given is not the only story that has been told. So Marius ends up leaving his aristocratic life behind. He goes out with his friends and starts fighting, and they form the barricade to fight on the behalf of the Republic. And it talks about Valjean basically trying to protect Cosette and keep her away from Marius, because of they've been writing love letters, and he's just afraid that Cosette's going to be taken up into the fray of the fight of the barricade and end up dying. And he plans to take Cosette away to England. He goes to find Marius, and it's kind of unclear initially that is he going to try to save Marius for the sake of Cosette? Is he going to make sure that Marius never returns to them? And so they're trying to, he's kind of at a crossroads, figuring out what he's going to do with Marius. And it talks about how all these people are selfish, and they're initially in the barricade only just for their own reasons. And then one of their comrades dies, and Marius pulls him back, and then they realize this is real, and people are dying in this fight for the barricade, and that they kind of band together in this fight, even though unfortunately the fight the barricade does not go well. Marius is deeply injured. Valjean ends up actually saving him, and even though Valjean finally does confess his true identity to Marius, that he was a thief and a criminal, and that he's no more than that, and Marius ends up being repulsed by Valjean, not really knowing all the good that Valjean has done. And then, though before Valjean ends up dying, Marius ends up finding all the truth out about Jean Valjean, and they have a reconciliation. And so the author mentions that Cosette and Marius's marriage is more than a love story that ends well. Their union brings about reconciliation, joy, hope, and love in an otherwise difficult story. And it's that marriage is an outward and visible way of recognizing an inward and spiritual grace, revealing how Christ is united to the church. So that's kind of the summary of the chapter, and I'm gonna read a few passages of scripture to you that are mentioned in the chapter and kind of relate them back to the chapter, and then we'll kind of summarize everything and close. So one of the scripture lessons that's mentioned in the chapter is from John 20, and it's verses 24 through 29. Now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." So a week later his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out with your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So that is reminding us, in this story, that there are people who believed it still was Jesus, even though they did not have to touch the nail holes or touch Jesus' side, that they did believe that it was Jesus. Now, moving back to Genesis, actually, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So this is really showing God's love for Abram and his calling that he gave Abram to do, and that God would bless him and all the peoples on the earth. Then we move to Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. "Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. Let him lead me to the banquet hall, and let his banner over me be love. Strengthen me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love." Moving next to Ephesians 5, verse 14. "This is why it is said, 'Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" John 15:13. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends," which makes you think of the lives that were lost at the barricade. And then finally, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13. "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love." And the end of the chapter, which I think is, as we're going to kind of close up this lesson, really kind of tied it all up for me, is that faith is trusting that God will do what God promised to do. Hope is trusting in things that are not yet seen. Love is certainly the greatest of these because it is the glue that holds faith and hope together. The love story between Marius and Cosette gives us hope. Even in the midst of suffering, violence, misplaced notions of justice, and human-made poverty, love is still at work. And even though this was set during Napoleon's era back in France hundreds of years ago, I think some of these same lessons apply to us today. And I think especially about this past year that we have all seen plenty of suffering, violence of many Black Americans in this country, misplaced notions of justice, poverty, people losing their jobs. I mean, it has been a rough year in many different ways, from the pandemic to many other things. However, there has still been love of God for us, love for our neighbors, love for our church, love for our community. Even in some of the worst times, you've seen some of the best stories, some of the most inspiring stories of people helping their neighbors out and helping each other, and really using their faith and hope to help us get through this time. I think some of the things that the fish pantry has been able to do this past year has been fantastic in that they have used faith and hope, and people have donated plenty of food, and they've been able to serve the workers working at the Shenandoah across the street, and so many people during Thanksgiving and Christmas time, and there have been so many positive stories throughout this pandemic in this past year that still gives us hope in spite of all the terrible things that have happened this year. So hopefully this leaves you with some hope as you are thinking about this Lenten journey. We're going towards Easter. Palm Sunday is coming. Then Easter is coming, and God will be risen. God will be risen indeed. Thank you so much.